Welcome to Somnolent Conspiracies, where we log the improbable the same way we log fingerprints, by detail, not by faith. Tonight's case drifts across the Bosphorus on a filament of sound. There's a small, stubborn AM station tucked above a bakery in Katakoi, the sort with a hand-painted logo and a transmitter that hums through the floorboards. Last month, on a windy night when gulls argued with the fairies, the station aired a true crime program about a homicide in Beyoğlu. Names, address, the bruise pattern, even the time the neighbor would call it in. The trouble is simple to say and difficult to live with. The broadcast aired 1 week before the body fell. Our narrator is Layla Arslan, a freelance producer with 1 foot in journalism and the other in audio repair. She can tell you what a dying capacitor smells like and when a witness is trying on adjectives. She knows the host, Amir Kaya, a mild man with a precise voice. He swears he never recorded the episode. His engineer swears there was no file in the playout. Yet the logging recorder shows a waveform at 21:17 and the station's audience. Cab drivers, insomniacs, fishermen winding nets, heard the story exactly as it would later happen. We will walk by night from Galata's steep streets to the masts on Kamlika Hill, listen to tape hiss like it means to confess, and take a careful measure of the word next. If a station can read a week ahead, someone will try to use it either to save a life or to stage an alibi cut to size. Keep your volume low enough to hear your own breath. The future is speaking. It does not care if you're ready. Part 1, Dead Air That Isn't. The bakery beneath Radio Yakima's closed at dusk, but the smell of sesame stayed in the stairwell. I climbed through it, past the flower fingerprints on the handrail and the faded flyer that promised a lost parakeet who would answer to Blue. The station door was unpainted wood. The glass had the station's name in flaking white letters that someone once traced by hand. When I pushed inside, the air changed from yeast to ozone. Something in the rack room had been left half awake. Amir Kaya was in the on-air booth with the lights low. He had the precise posture of a man who spent years not touching the faders unless he had to. His voice always sounded like a clean dial tone to me. In person, that calm sat behind careful eyes. "Layla," he said through the glass and pressed the talkback. 1 second. I nodded and hung my bag from a chair with the confidence of someone who had carried the same bag across 3 editors and a dozen formats. On the engineer side of the glass, Salim was bent over a computer tower that hummed out of tempo. His shirt carried the night shift from the bakery downstairs. He did not look up. "You got my message," I said to Amir when he stepped out. He shrugged in the Istanbul way that meant yes, and also the world is a wheel. We got a message from half the city. Taxi drivers, insomniacs, fishermen, all with the same opinion. They heard something that should not have existed. He led me down the narrow corridor where the walls had been patched and repatched with different shades of beige paint. "The logger is in here," he said, and opened a room that would have been a closet if the shelves did not carry half the station's memory. DAT cassettes stacked in toffee-colored cases. Spools of 1/4-inch tape in tins labeled in handwriting that had outlived a few owners. A modern logging recorder blinked green, as if to insist on its place in the line of succession. I had the listener tip open in my mind. The caller swore that last week the station aired a true crime segment that named the victim, the address on Istiklal Caddesi, the bruise pattern from a fallen wall hook, and the time the neighbor would call. The police found the body 7 days later. 1 week ahead, the voice had said, "Next Thursday at 21:17. I set my bag on the shelf and took out a notebook, a small screwdriver, and 2 pairs of headphones, because I have learned never to share. "Tell me about the night," I said. Salim finally looked over. The playout computer crashed at 21:16. I did not touch anything. It restored by itself, only the audio kept going. The meters moved while the software said nothing was playing. He pushed his hand through his hair like it was a loop he ran when nervous. The system made a log file with a path that reads null. Amir folded his arms. "We do not do prophecy, Layla. We do late-night chess talk and football call-ins and sometimes a concert bootleg that somehow sounds worse on the radio than it did in person. We did not record that segment." I leaned over the logging recorder. The file listing was ordinary, hour blocks named by date and time. Then a narrow strip of data that did not match the naming scheme. It was a 14-minute piece that began at 21:17. The name field was blank. The path field said null. I scrolled back a few weeks. There it was again, 1 week before at the same minute, a similar strip. I scrolled forward to the night of the murder. The strip was absent. The station had been airing football talk that night with a host who laughed like a stalled motor. Listeners still heard the crime, though. They heard it on the earlier date. I plugged in headphones and cued the segment. Noise first. Not tape hiss, something like an empty room being described in breath. Then a tone that stepped down 3 notes. Clean intervals like a school bell that had never learned to be cheerful. After the tone, a voice spoke in the slow patience of someone who has a map he has already folded and unfolded. The narrator was calm. Not Amir, not Ayaz from his sensational podcast, not any voice I knew. He described the apartment on Istiklal Caddesi, the mailboxes, the scent of frying peppers from the neighbor below, and the hook by the door whose screw had never quite taken. He had the detail you do not guess if you have not stood in the hallway. The voice never turned dramatic. It simply read the future into the present tense. At minute 12, a street dog barked twice in the distance, which would later match myself and 3 other recordings made by strangers who did not know each other. At minute 13 and a half, the interval tone returned, just a ghost fraction louder than before. I tapped the time code on my notebook. 21:17, I said. Salim pointed at the monitor. The power dipped again right there. Not a full blackout, a brownout. The light sighed and came back. Same on the next Thursday. Same time, same tone. We had nothing rolled. The playout computer insisted it was idle. But the console meters danced all the same. Show me the physical chain, I said. If this came from upstream, we need to walk it. The studio to transmitter link used a microwave hop to Kamlika Hill like every small station that could not afford a lease line. Amir unlocked the rack. A silver box with warmth-scarred paint showed the link status as a single bar below full. On a printout tacked to the wall, I saw old entries in a dead engineer's penciled hand. The handwriting had been careful even when the man was tired. At 21:16 on multiple Thursdays, he had drawn a small music note, a habit you only pick up if your life is lived between tones. Salim watched me trace the chain with my finger. Studio output, silence sensor, insertion point for emergency announcements, studio to transmitter link encoder, antenna. I could feel the places where the system would accept a ghost. I have worked with enough stations to know that ghosts like convenience. They prefer ports that have done honest labor before. I asked for last week's calls. Amir dug them out, a simple wave folder full of people arguing with the night. Cab drivers called in with their engines running. Fishermen called from the pier while the wind pushed through the mic. All of them described the same thing, a segment that predicted a murder 1 week early. None of them said prophecy. They said the radio told them, and the radio is the only clock that never lies. I took the logging room key and closed the door so I could listen to the full 14 minutes alone. The voice did not waver. It spoke as if read from a typewritten page that had been edited with a pencil. It knew the address and the bruise and the timing of the neighbor who would call when she smelled iron and detergent together. It did not gloat. It did not warn. It did not ask for belief. It laid out a path that the city would later walk. When it ended, I rewound to just before the voice and listened for anything that might live in the tone. There was a harmonic I did not like, a thin whistle that might have been a quartz clock drifting against the mains frequency. I could almost smell it, the sweet metallic tang of a capacitor near failure. My throat tightened with a very old memory. A father at a kitchen table with a radio in pieces and a cigarette resting in the ashtray with more ash than ember. The sound of a dying capacitor is something you learn once and never forget. But the harmonic stayed in the tone in a way I could not blame on one failing part. I took a DAT cassette from the stack, labeled it with the date, the time, and a note that said interval tone present. The labeler squeaked with each letter. I placed the cassette in my bag after recording a copy of the anomalous strip. Outside, a gull called with the indifference of a creature that does not honor weeks. "So you think this is a prank?" Amir said in the doorway. "You think it is Ayaz trying to show me that his stories own the night?" "I think pranks smirk," I said. "This thing keeps its hands in its pockets. And I think if a voice can name next Thursday once, it will try to name it again. If we sit here feeling violated, we will stay violated. If we build a box around it, we can see which way it enters the room. Salim rubbed his eyes with his knuckles. You are going to ask me to rebuild the safety chain. We do not have budget. We have enough tape, I said. We have more than enough tape. I walked back into the studio and looked through the glass at the console, at the meters sleeping like cats. The hum in the racks had settled into a note that did not quite agree with the lights. The bakery below knocked pans around as the owner cleaned. Somewhere in Katakoi, a fairy horn answered another horn, a call and response that had outlasted 1,000 small stations. I listened for the city between those notes. It sounded like a patient creature eager to be told the next thing. This is what I need, I said. A schedule for next Thursday. 3 recorders. 1 is your logger as usual. 1 is mine in the rack room with a hard line from the console. 1 is a software-defined radio at my apartment across the water so we have off-air capture. I want a taxi dispatcher listening with his dash camera timestamp ready. I want a fisherman on the pier with his phone pointed at the water. If the voice appears again, we catch it from 3 angles and the street catches it too. Amir did not like being told what to do in his own house. He also did not like being lied to by whatever lived in his transmitter chain. He nodded once. Layla, I do not want to be the station that killed a woman because it gave a man a clock. Then we will not be, I said. We will be the place where a city heard itself early and chose to act. On my way out, I paused at the wall where the old engineer had penciled his music notes. I put my finger on one and felt the texture of graphite under paint. It was the same as a bruise echoing under skin. You could cover it, but it stayed. On the stairs, the scent of sesame returned. A child outside laughed at a dog that had stolen a cimet. The future speaks if you leave a channel open. You survive it by answering with your own voice. I took the DAT cassette, my notebook, and a conviction made of wires and habit. Next Thursday would come whether I listened or not. I intended to be there when the interval fell and to catch the breath before the voice began. Part 2, a week's lead. On the Monday before next Thursday, I built the box. It was not a mystical box. It was cables, schedules, people who owed me favors, and a willingness to sit still while a clock struck out of turn. In the rack room, I ran a clean split from the console to the station logger. The logger would keep doing its lawful work, eating hours and blinking as if it understood what it devoured. I ran a second line to my recorder and tested the gain until the meters moved the way I wanted, just shy of red, giving the noise bed a place to lie down without lifting its head. I taped the cable ends like a medic sealing a bandage. I labeled everything. The act of labeling steadied my hands. At my apartment in Moda, I set a small software-defined radio on the windowsill that faced the water. I tuned it to our frequency and let its thin antenna point at the night like a question. I connected it to a laptop that would not sleep. I tested the system by playing back the fairy horns from late afternoon. The horns came through with the distortion of air over distance. That distortion would be good for the trial. If the anomaly only lived on the wire, the air would betray it. If the air carried it, we would have heard the truth together. Amir agreed to keep the studio dry of any pre-recorded segments. No carts, no safety announcements, no station identifications that were not live and simple. If he had to fill, he would talk about the neighborhood cats as if they were a soccer team. Salim double-checked the emergency insertion point. He did it with the grudging care of a man who does not want to believe in ghosts but will stack garlic on the sill all the same. I called Murat, a taxi dispatcher with the disposition of a heavy kettle. He boiled slow and stayed warm long after the burner was off. He put 3 drivers on listen duty with instructions to keep their dash cameras rolling and their radio volumes set so that the microphone could hear the broadcast. I told him to call me the moment anything odd crossed the speakers. He told me odd never stopped. I said this odd would pretend to be a public service announcement and that he would know it by the way his skin responded before his mind did. He laughed until he realized I was not joking. On Thursday, I arranged for a fisherman I knew to take his phone to the pier and record nothing. Recording nothing is harder than recording something. He stood there in the onshore wind and let the sound of waves collect like soft coins. Sometimes the best evidence is an empty room that knows it is being watched. I arrived at the station 2 hours early. Salim was baking downstairs by habit and by economy. He came up with a tray of simit and the offhand apology of a man who understands hunger better than manners. Amir had his tea and a stack of paper with scribbles about traffic and a protest that might gather or might dissolve into smoke in the first rain. He held the night loosely. At 21, he would take the mic and carry us toward the minute that had become a ritual for someone who did not sign their name. The city leaned into its evening. On the balcony below the window, someone watered basil in chipped plastic pots and sang off-key to an old pop song. A gull complained over nothing. Lights softened to the color of faded copper. I listened to all of it with the distant sense one gets before a fever breaks. I checked my watch and checked it again. I am not a believer in omens, but I am a believer in the behavior of seconds. At 21:10, Amir began an innocuous conversation about the way bread disappears faster when left on a counter. He asked for calls about small household mysteries. He kept his sentences round and careful, the way you speak to a friend who is coming awake from a bad dream. 2 callers joked, one about the thinness of modern plastic wrap and one about a cat who could open a window latch on humid days. It was exactly the sort of talk that keeps a small station afloat when there is no money but there is attention. I stood in the rack room with one headphone cup over my right ear and the other lifted so I could hear the room. Salim stood in the doorway and did not pretend he had something else to do. He had scrubbed his hands, but flour dust lived in the stitches of his shirt. He watched the logger with an expression that would have been reverence if he had any appetite for reverence. At 21:16, the lights stepped down. A brownout draped itself over the building like a thin blanket. It did not kill anything. Pressed the room a half-inch closer to the floor. The hum in the racks changed pitch. From the on-air room, Amir's voice held steady. But when he paused to sip tea, an absence appeared in the second that should have followed. The interval tone entered the room. 3 descending notes, unadorned and exact. Cut the air cleanly. In the headphones, the tone was a narrow blade. In the room, it was a fork on a stone plate. The tone carried a faint whistle at its edges, like the echo of a watch trying to stay accurate. I circled the phenomenon with my mind the way a diver floats a few meters above a wreck before committing to a landing. When the voice arrived, it was the same calm as before. It did not announce itself. It did not say we interrupt this program. It began in the middle of a sentence about a small door that would not close flush unless lifted an inch. The voice named a building in Üsküdar where the interior doors had swollen in damp springs for a decade. It described a burglary that would discover a resident unexpectedly home. It described a scuffle that would tilt a lamp, and then the edge of a carpet that would slide. It did not call it a murder. It called it a fall that a hand would complete. I wrote the time on my notebook anyway. 21:17. I had written it before. My hand did not shake. I breathed in the taste of warm power, dust a hair from combustion, and the faint bitterness that hung from old solder. Amir looked through the glass at me. He did not stop the program. He could not. The console meters were moving without him. His hands hovered over faders as if hands could negotiate with a river. He let the board listen. The voice spoke a minute-by-minute description. It named next Thursday again. It named the minute again. It did not say the word prophecy. It did not make claims. It made statements. A window left on the latch would breathe in and out. A lock that favored heavy keys would slow an intruder who trusted his fingers too much. The voice had the patience of a coroner and the conscience of a clerk. I glanced at the station logger. Recording. I checked my recorder. Recording. I texted a single word to Murat. Now, from the window, I could see only a slice of the street. The bakery sign glowed with the last of its stored heat. For a moment, the sign dimmed, and when it brightened, the letter A in the hand-painted name did not come back quite as strong. There are parts of a city that reveal stress the way skin reveals stress. Paint records blows that people ignore. The voice concluded with the sentence shape it had used on the previous recording. It offered no moral. It let the interval tone return, but the second time the tone was strained, as if the source wanted to speak longer than its design allowed. Then it was gone. Amir had the mic again, and he resumed his conversation about small household mysteries. He did not acknowledge the interruption. He would not give it that dignity. I stepped back from the rack and played back the last minute on my recorder. The phase of the tone and the room sound matched the logger down to a hair. I knew this not only by ear but by the way the waveform displayed. I resisted the urge to say the technical term aloud. Saying names over anomalies can make you feel in control when you are not. I sent the capture from my apartment to the station and pulled it onto the monitor. That off-air file had the same relationship. The drift was identical. The room noise was the same breath, which meant the source sat upstream of us all. The studio had been a listener like the rest of us. Salim let out a soft sound he did not intend to make. He folded his prayer beads into his palm. He did not count them. He said nothing. His eyes were damp in a way that was neither tears nor illness. He looked as if he had heard a voice come from a radio he had buried with someone he loved. I did not look away. The phones began to ring in the on-air booth. Amir answered two and let them go quickly. The callers did not argue. They just wanted to say they were present. A fisherman sent me a video of the water. The video showed waves and a dark line where the city met the night. The audio was the broadcast as my off-air recorder heard it. The wind scratched across the microphone, but the tone cut through like honest metal. A taxi driver sent a clip the size of a postage stamp. In the frame, his dashboard glowed a soft green. When the voice spoke, the screen lines on his radio danced to the vowels. He put his finger into the frame without meaning to, trembled once. I gathered the captures and dated them. I did not label the voice. I did not want to assign its shape to a name that might mislead me later. I noted the static cadence between the tone and the first word. I noted a small tap that preceded a paragraph, which could have been a ring against a desk or a nail against a wood case. The detail mattered. It might lead me to hands. When the hour ended, I sat with Amir and played the off-air file into the board so we could listen in the quiet of the booth. Our voices did not live in the room for a few minutes. The three notes fell. The narrator spoke. He had no throat clearing, no soft mouth noises, no chair creak. He could have been a dead man reading from a perfect posture, or a living one who practiced for a lifetime. Either way, his sentences arrived like fixed stair treads. You did not trip if you walked at his pace. So it is not in the playout, Amir said. It is not a file mislabel. It is not an operator error. No, I said. It is older and simpler than that. It is somewhere a human would stand in order to be upstream of a studio that prides itself on being upstream of noise. We follow the chain. We go to the hill. Salim nodded without speaking. The relief on his face came not from safety but from instruction. Doing something is a kind of mercy. I left the station with the night colder than before. Across the water, the tower lights on the hill blinked in their unhurried code. They did not know about our little ritual at 2117. Or they did and had decided not to care. At home, my software-defined radio saved its file and named it by the custom counting I had given it. I watched the progress bar finish with a small satisfaction that had nothing to do with belief and everything to do with practice. I set my alarm for dawn. Kamlika would be wind at that hour. The equipment would be more honest when chilled. In bed, I listened to the city breathing through the open window. Somewhere a dog barked twice, as if to remind me that patterns are a net you throw into water. Sometimes you pull up the same fish. Sometimes the net comes up heavy with something that never learned to have a name. I thought about a voice that told a story exactly 1 week ahead and the way a hand will reach for a doorknob even when warned. If the future had a schedule, it also had a habit. Habits have edges. You can cut yourself on them. You can also catch them. Part 3, the antenna on Kamlika. Dawn made a clean sound on the hill. The kind of clear the city only remembers for a few minutes before the day begins to grind. I climbed the access road with a coil of cokes slung over my shoulder and a small tool bag knocking against my thigh. The masts above Kamlika rose like a set of slender bones. Their red lights were off now that the sun had taken custody. Wind moved across the slope in a steady push that let me imagine I was walking inside a long breath. A guard at the outer gate checked my letter from the station with the weary care of a man who had learned to be polite to people who carry small, heavy cases. He waved me through and went back to his tea. The maintenance shack sat low against a retaining wall. The door stuck in the frame until I lifted it by the handle and put my shoulder into the push. The room smelled of dust and ozone and an old brand of grease that had outlived the company that made it. I stood still with the door closed and counted the tones the room made. A rack of link gear hummed at a steady pitch. A fan added a beat. Somewhere inside a brushed metal chassis, a transformer held a faint grumble that you would only notice if you had slept in rooms like this for years. The studio to transmitter link receiver showed lock. The bar sat one notch shy of full strength. That had always been true for this station. The hop had one corner of the city in the way, and you learned to live with a notch. I connected a small spectrum analyzer and let it listen. The hill was always busy. Broadcast carriers stood in rows like narrow buildings. The station's own carrier sat where it belonged. I looked at 2116 from the last 2 weeks. The logger in the rack had kept its own diary. At that minute, a faint secondary shape had appeared near the link frequency. A ghost carrier. It rose like heat and held for the length of the anomalous segment. It did not replace the main signal. It sat beside it, a shadow repeated by a mirror you did not remember placing there. I traced the insertion points. Emergency audio could be fed here, the way civil alerts or station identifications get laced into a chain that prefers to be simple. The panel had been opened many times. The screws showed tool scars from years of hands that were not always patient. A narrow shelf of spares stood against the far wall. Coils of cable. A box of belts for decks no one kept any longer. At the bottom was a cart machine with no label. I slid the machine out and set it on the bench. A broadcast cart deck was the sort of thing that had once been everywhere. A tape loop lived in a hard plastic cartridge. You dropped it into the slot and pressed the big square button. The machine ate the cart and spoke on command. This one had dust in its corners and a clean stripe where fingertips had found it recently. In the bay, a cart sat with no writing on its face. The felt pressure pad was worn but not collapsed. I ejected it and found a sticky note that clung to the top with a film of static. The note said in neat block letters in Turkish, "Do not erase." The kind of admonition that is 60% instruction and 40% superstition. I opened the deck. Inside, a tiny quartz clock ran from a coin battery that had been replaced not long ago. The clock read 7 days ahead of the day. Not 7 days plus a handful of random minutes. 7 days to the minute. The hands marked the same time as my wristwatch would mark in 1 week if everything stayed alive. A piece of black tape had been cut to fit under the dial. It had been trimmed carefully, as if someone had taken pride in the way the tape did not buckle. I connected the machine to my headphones with a thin coupler and pressed play. Room tones stepped out as if it had been waiting in a line made of silence. After a few seconds, a female voice began to read in the neutral style of old public announcements. General drills. Shelter in place. Keep water in bottles. The words came from a policy decade with a different shape of fear. I listened to the noise floor. The sound had the soft grain of an aging tape, but not the rough drag of a broken loop. Someone had spliced a new section into an old body. I stopped the cart and advanced it by hand. A small index wheel under the chassis counted perforations in a clear leader as if marking notches on a stick. Every 7 days the wheel would align with a reed switch and tick a relay. The relay would pull. If the insertion line was armed, the cart would fire into the chain. Simple. Relentless. You could build it with a pocketful of parts and the kind of stubborn patience that keeps the dead useful. I placed the cart back in and pressed play again. Near the middle there was a splice. The adhesive had a chemical tang I had met before in repair shops and kitchens. Cyanoacrylate leaves a sweetness that you would not know to name unless you had opened small tubes in too many poorly ventilated rooms. It was faint. It was there. I ran a cotton swab lightly along the tape edge and docked the swab in a small vial. Later I would look for flour dust and any other domestic fingerprints that liked to hitch a ride on glue. I checked the rack again. The main link did not care whether the cart sat in the shelf or the bin. The ghost carrier had not been born from that deck alone. The deck was a ritual object, an offering in an electrical shrine. Someone had placed it here because someone believed in the weight of tradition. You are never free of rituals in radio. Even the modern rigs respect the old gestures. A hand reaches for a big square button, whether or not that button is wired to anything that still bosses the signal. The maintenance log on the wall held the pencil marks of the man who had kept this room honest before me. He had the kind of script people develop when they repair the same bad solder joint 100 times. At 21:16, on a run of Thursdays that ended 5 years ago, he had drawn 3 small notes in a downward step. Maybe he doodled. Maybe he recorded a test tone he used to check the alignment of an emergency chain. The marks had been made before he died. The marks had outlived him. They were, in their way, as bossy as any live tone. I followed the coax to the wall panel. A slot above the silence sensor wore new rubs. If you wanted to slip a signal into the path without waking software that thinks it is king, this was the place. The silence sensor did not look for what arrived. It looked for what left. Feed it enough, not nothing, and it would not cry out. Outside the shack, the hill felt older than the city. I walked the path toward the mass base where poured concrete met earth. A rectangle of soil near the foundation looked disturbed in the way dirt looks when someone has been careful but not obsessive. The wind had flattened the surface and tucked a skin of dust over it, but the contour still slumped. A small stone had been set back where it belonged and then walked on once to make it look at home. I knelt and pressed my fingers into the grit. The temperature there held a trace of cool that the morning should have smoothed. The earth remembers boxes. It remembers where a human has opened a square and closed it again. I took photos. I measured distances without trusting the numbers to become theory yet. I made a sketch. The tower hummed in a register you feel between your molars. In the distance, fairies hauled the sound of their horns up the hill and let it roll past like large tired animals. Back in the shack, I called Amir and put him on speaker. The room made his voice thin, but I could still hear the care he wore as a guard. I told him about the cart deck. I told him about the quartz clock that had been set 1 week forward with the discipline of a man who loves exact borders. He went quiet. "That machine is not on any inventory I signed," he said. "I know," I said. "Someone brought it because someone thought the future speaks better through a mouth with history. But the real voice is not in the cart. The real voice rides the link like a second train on a track that already has one. Our chain accepts it because the emergency path is built to say yes. And because a small brownout at 21:16 opens the door and bows politely." Salim joined the call from the station. I pictured him at the bench with his beads laid out like punctuation. He asked if the link showed the ghost now. "Not now," I said. "It only shows at the minute." But the shelf had dust and a clean stripe. A hand has fed a cart into a ritual and then taken it away, because leaving the cart would be too bold even for a believer. I found a note on the plastic that said, "Do not erase." The hand that wrote it belongs to a dead engineer. Either someone copied his script from an old log to dress the thing, or the note itself has moved from era to era like a charm. Salim exhaled. He did not ask if I believed in curses. He did not need me to say no. I left the cart machine where I found it and labeled my vial. The hill would tolerate my trespass for another hour before official maintenance began and the day crew started their rounds. I took one last look at the quartz clock. Its second hand ticked in clean half steps, as if it distrusted the lag between positions. 7 days ahead. To the minute. Whoever set it had done so with enough care to make the air notice. I closed the door gently so the hinge would not shout. On the way down the path, I passed a plastic bag that had caught on a bush and rattled like an old flag. I lifted it free and carried it to the bin because I could not ignore small repair when I was chasing a larger one. At the gate, the guard poured tea into a paper cup and handed it to me without a word. I drank and tasted the metal of the samovar more than the leaf. His radio sat on the table beside him. It hissed and muttered with distant voices. No tone. No calm narration leaking from the future, just the ordinary work of the morning. In the car, I wrote 3 lines in my notebook because I trust my hand more than any recorder. First line, the ghost carrier appears before the studio, in the link path. Second line, a ritual device exists but does not originate the voice. Third line, a clock in that ritual is set 1 week ahead, down to the minute. I underlined the word minute. I do not like theatrics in my notes, but sometimes emphasis is a mercy to the mind that must return later and remember the weight of what it saw. I drove down from Kamlika with the masts in the rear mirror. The city opened under the hill the way a book opens when you have already read it once. I felt no closer to the voice and yet closer to the hands. Cart machine. A quartz clock. A disturbed seam of dirt at a mast base. These were not omens. They were parts. Parts were a comfort. Parts could be traced to buyers, to maintenance logs, to men who liked to hold a small square of tape against light and nod when the splice aligns. At a red light, I listened again to our capture from the night before. The 3 descending notes were naked and honest. The voice that followed was patient and unforgiving. It knew a bruise that would not happen now that someone had put tape over a wall hook. It knew a fall that could rearrange itself. Whoever was writing or rewriting those segments had a body. A body would leave flour and glue, would set a clock, would stand where the brownout made courage feel like permission. The hill receded behind me. The station waited ahead, perched over the bakery that smelled like a promise. I would go back there and ask the gear to tell me what it had already told me twice. The source was upstream. The cart was a mouthpiece that loved attention. The hand that fed it believed in timing more than in mercy. I meant to find that hand. Part 4, the voice that knows bruises. Hale Sanmez lived in a narrow building in Üsküdar where the stairwell kept the smell of boiled laundry and cumin. On the landing, a plant in a cracked pot leaned toward the door that caught the morning light. The neighbors used the corridor as a string for their lives. Plastic slippers, a folded stroller, a bag of onions that had forgotten its cool place. I did not knock. I called from the street, my voice low, and I used no name. The warning was simple. Someone had spoken about her apartment on the radio 1 week early. The voice had described a fall that a hand would finish. I told her to vary her week and to be careful with locks. I spoke like a stranger who had seen a future and did not want credit. She laughed, warm and skeptical. She said that if fate had learned her address, fate could climb stairs like anyone else. Then she agreed to change one thing. She would leave for work 10 minutes earlier on the day in question. Only 10. She would not let a story bully her day. I walked up the street and listened to the traffic push around a stalled delivery van. The city was a river around a rock. I turned and looked back. Hale came to the window with a towel over her shoulder and a clip between her teeth. She waved the towel once to shake it straight. She was alive. The voice had named her before she became a file on a desk. That mattered. The broadcast had mentioned a crescent-shaped mark. A contusion that would live under skin like a moon behind cloth. It would match a fallen wall hook, the narrator had said, whose screw had never taken well. I wanted a hook I could tape before gravity made it an author. That meant a visit before Thursday. Hale answered the door this time. She had a direct way of standing, 1 foot slightly ahead of the other, as if expecting a football to roll toward her. The hallway inside was newly painted in a color that stores call sand, but that apartments turned to a light brown gray within a month. The door frame was scarred where groceries had scraped by for years. "Show me the hook," I said. She laughed again and led me to the small entrance with a bench for shoes and a mirror with a chip in one corner. The hook had been mounted just above shoulder height. The screw had chewed the drywall in a circle that betrayed impatience. The hook sagged when weight hung from it. If you brushed it, it would pivot down like a tiny seesaw and kiss the wall. It would leave a mark if it fell. I pressed lightly and felt motion, a small surrender. I taped the hook with a strip of cloth tape from my bag. I pressed the tape smooth to spread the force. The gesture was ordinary. It created a fault in the broadcast that I wanted. "Do you believe in this?" she asked. "I believe in people who listen and in habits that can be broken," I said. "I believe a voice on a radio may be timed by a human hand. The rest is shadow. We will test the shadow." She looked at the tape and considered the difference between a danger removed and a danger delayed. She lifted her bag to her shoulder and looked at her watch. 10 minutes early today, she said, then smiled at the game she had now entered. She left, and I set a small contact microphone on the wall near the hook and a time slate on the shelf. I did it with her permission. I told her to do nothing strange and to tell no one else. If the voice was being read by a pair of ears, I did not want to feed it. Back at the station, I poured coffee and let it sit while I pulled a stack of old scripts written by Ayaz Demir. He ran a popular podcast that liked to press detail into the shape of drama. He could not resist a gerund, cutting into the night, breathing like a room, rising on the last word before the break. The anomalous voice used the same rhythm, but that rhythm was a common habit in the trade. It was not proof. Still, the parallel bothered the ear. I went to a Yaz in the late afternoon. His studio was in a basement that smelled of an air conditioner filter that should have been changed last season. Posters from festivals he had almost one decorated the walls. He had a smile that survived beyond the point where it had earned its keep. "You think I used your little station as a ghost story machine," he said, amused. "You think I recorded a prediction, buried it in the chain, and let the city carry it like a rumor with teeth?" I told him I thought he had a style that liked to lace verbs together until they formed a chain that dragged listeners forward. I told him the voice that had spoken our 2 segments had a style like that. I left silence, and he loved silence because silence makes the next sentence taller. He offered me an alibi, a set of recording sessions on both Thursday nights. He would play them for me start to end. He clicked open a folder and cued the first. In the headphones, the air of his room was different from ours, a little too dead, a little too narrow. He spoke into his fixed future about a case in the province. He kept time with his hands. He hit a paragraph that ended on a breath. I rewound a second and listened to the space before the sentence. There it was, the faintest form of our descending tone, buried under his noise reduction, like a watermark in paper. If I did not already have the sound living in my mind, I might have missed it. He saw me tilt my head and he grew cautious. He did not like his control to be visible. "You hear something," he said. "I hear a tone that does not belong to your room," I said. "I hear a note that belongs to a link chain or to a habit laid down by an old engineer. I hear you covering it with a tool. I do not hear you announce a future, but I hear you standing near a device that has learned to announce one." He grew annoyed, which was better than confidence. He pointed out that the tone is in many rooms. He said the city is full of weak power, and power likes to sing. He said he had, at worst, been near a radio left on. He said the podcast had borrowed the station once for a late mix when his own place had flooded and that he had liked the sound of their old compressor, but that was months ago. I asked where the pirate band was thick near his street. He showed me on a map nearly without thinking. He sniffed at the inconvenience. Pirates irritated him when they broke his stream but flattered him when they repeated his work. The harmonics near his building ran hot at midnight. A narrow strip at a strange half-step, more doorbell than broadcast. I took a note and thanked him for the alibi. He told me to send listeners his way when I found my ghost. He said he would know how to make it interesting. Outside his building, the evening collected like steam. On a flat roof nearby, a tangle of wire lay beside a collapsible mast. It had the ungainly look of a rig that jumps between windows when a landlord complains. I took a photograph and walked on. The sky over the hill had begun to take color. That night I sat in the station with Amir and Salim and played our 2 anomalous segments end to end. We listened for fingerprints. The consonants were too careful to be a first-timer. The breathing had the control of someone who had learned to empty his lungs before the first word. The pauses were not edits. They were choices. If it was a Yaz, he would be proud of the control. If it was not, the person who had made this voice had lived with a microphone for years. We searched the silence for taps. 2 at minute 5. 1 small knock against wood at minute 9. The kind of sound a ring would make if brushed by a thumb. Details create hands. I had second thoughts about the way we had warned Hale. I do not like to move pieces on other people's boards, but sometimes the board does not ask your permission. I called her and asked her to describe her night routine from the stairwell to the lamp in the living room. She recited it in the tone of someone indulging a relative. She had the rhythm of a week laid over a year. I asked how she set down her keys. She set them on an iron dish by the door. I told her to place the dish on the floor that night and to leave the table empty. I told her to say nothing about it, even to herself. Words can make the air telegraph its next move. She sighed and agreed. She asked if I would be there on the stairwell on the night in question. I said yes, but that I would stand quiet and that she should not look to me. She thanked me in a voice that sounded like someone speaking to a stranger on a bus who has adjusted a strap she could not reach. At the station, I pulled up a map of the link from the studio to the hill and dropped a handful of pins on rooflines where someone could throw a narrow beam at the path without needing to touch our building. Ayaz Street sat within one of those angles. That could be a frame. It could also be a cooperation of convenience. I did not yet know which I had. My mind circled the thought like a bird over a small pool. Do not land too soon. Do not mistake reflection for depth. Salim went down to the bakery and came back with tea and bread with sesame. He stood beside the rack as if a man could stand guard over a machine and have the machine respond to courtesy. Amir read messages from listeners who had heard the second interruption. He wrote each time and name by hand. He kept a record because a record makes a moment honest. We do this in radio because light is not enough. Close to midnight, I walked to the roof. Catacoi glittered and sagged. The ferries wrote their long, bright lines on the water. I could see the hill in the distance with its towers like needles, knitting a blanket over a patient none of us understood. I set a small loop of wire on the parapet and listened for the tone. The night offered only wind and old music drifting up from a car that would need a new battery by morning. I went back downstairs and wrote in my notebook. The voice knows the bruise because the voice has stood in the hallway, or because the voice eats police reports before the city is allowed to digest them, or because the voice is a hand that means to make the bruise and cannot help describing the pleasure of prediction. The rival with the stylish sentences may be a mask, or he may be a vanity that the real hand will use to mislead. A map of pirate harmonics draws a circle around possibility. The circle holds names. I stopped my pen and put my finger on the date. If we waited for the voice to drop again, we would be late. The shape of the threat was not only prediction. It was rehearsal. Someone would listen and write notes of their own. Someone would alter one detail so that when a neighbor coughed, the future would flex rather than break. The broadcast was not only a script. It was a means. The person behind it would be disciplined. The person would be on time. We would meet that person not in the studio and not on the hill, but in the stairwell where intention has to pick a step. I called Hale one more time and told her I would station neighbors on 2 landings. I would tape over the hook. I would seat a contact mic and a slate. I would give the corridor light a new bulb. She laughed and told me not to make the building too perfect or the city would stop recognizing it. I told her that on Thursday at the appointed minute we would be imperfect in the direction of survival. She said she would change nothing else. 10 minutes earlier, the same route, the same keys in the same pocket. She was not afraid, or she was afraid in a way that had found a place to sit. I ended the call and looked at Amir and Salim. They both nodded, each in his own way. In the recorder room, I set fresh labels and dated them. The tape for the stair, the tape for the hook, the tape for the door. The act of naming made me calm. The voice could keep its godlike tone. We would keep our hands busy and wait for the clock that does not consent to be ignored. Part 5, Thursday -1. The stairwell in Hale Sanmez building kept its own slow weather. On Thursday, it held a damp that rose from the laundry room, a trace of lemon cleaner, and the thin iron taste of old pipes. I arrived at dusk with a canvas bag and the sort of permission a person grants when fear has been translated into chores. Hale stood by the door with her keys and her good coat already on. She had the measured impatience of someone who would not be bullied by a clock, even the city's. I did a last pass. The new bulb in the corridor threw a flatter light than the old one. No shadow pockets grew at the corners where a hand might hide. The contact mic I had taped to the wall near the hook had its lead running under the doormat and into a small recorder in the shoe cabinet. A timecode slate sat on the bench with its digits disciplined, 7-segment numerals breathing in perfect seconds. The wall hook was wrapped with the cloth tape I had pressed down the day before, the adhesive creased smooth by my thumb. The neighbors I had recruited took their places. On the landing below, a retired mathematics teacher named Yavuz sat on a folding chair with a newspaper on his lap. On the landing above, a nurse named Asuman leaned against the railing with a grocery bag, a believable prop. I asked both to cough if they heard a step that did not belong to anyone who lived here. The cough was not an alarm. It was a change to the air that the city would accept without thinking. Hale locked her door and looked at me. Her eyes were steady. 10 minutes early, she said, as promised. She held the keys differently, as if aware of the wait for the first time. She took the stairs down past Yavuz, who did not look up from the puzzle he had not started, and past Asuman, who checked her phone and nodded once like a friend. The door below banged softly. Hale's footfalls faded into the noise of the street, into cart wheels, into a bus huffing a corner. I stood where the corridor narrowed. The small mirror in the entrance showed me as a stripe and nothing more. The building made its usual sounds. A television on 2 floors down hummed through a thin wall. A child sang a fragment of a song about a bird and then lost interest. Water ran for a minute and shut off with a clank. I set my watch by the slate and waited for the minute we had learned to respect. At the station, Amir sat at the console with his headphones on but off one ear so the room could still have him. Salim stood by the logger and stared at the meters as if choosing to watch them could alter their behavior. My software-defined radio at home spun its blind record without the comfort of my hands on it. The hill breathed its own air through the masts. The city approached the minute from a dozen directions. 21:16 pressed down. The corridor light did not dim, not that my eyes could see, but the hum in the wiring shifted sideways by a fraction. In the station, the bulbs leaned, then corrected. Salim whispered that the brownout had arrived. The slate rolled past 21:16 and 30, clean seconds that felt like teeth being counted in a dark mouth. The interval tone fell. 3 notes, not loud in the stairwell, but present in the wall like a memory in a muscle. The contact mic caught the tone as a light vibration skittering through paint and plaster. In the station, the tone cut across the board with the same exact spacing as last week. Amir touched no fader. He let the board stand still and be embarrassed by its passivity. The voice arrived on air. I could not hear it in the corridor. I would listen later to what it had said. I knew what mattered. The schedule had been invoked. A man who loved clocks would begin to move inside that minute. The voice spoke of a burglary in Uskadar, of a small door swollen by damp, of a lamp that would tilt when a hand brushed a table, of a rug edge that tugged back like a reluctant animal. It spoke as if it had already wiped the blood. Calm. No moral. The voice on the radio seemed to be beyond reach, so I turned my attention to the reach of feet. A footstep on the stair below, light and slow. Not Hale. Hale descended with a sharper heel and a pace that scolded the steps. This was a careful foot. Paused as if to listen, then took the last 2 steps in a single slide. The air in the hall cooled by a hair, the way a closed hand cools a body when lifted away. Asuman coughed once. Could have been a winter throat clearing. The cough echoed wrongly. The person on the stair stopped. The new bulb made a bright oval on the landing. The oval brightened a second later when the person took a half step into it and then withdrew. The smell that reached me was neither sweat nor laundry nor familiar cologne. It was the stale sweetness of rubber from an old elevator belt, the kind of scent a basement hands out to a person who spends the day in the mechanical spaces of buildings. The intruder hesitated. The plan had not accounted for a nurse with a grocery bag. The plan had not accounted for a new bulb or a camera lens that would reflect a narrow face in a convex sheen. A faint scrape against plaster, like a knuckle brushing a corner on purpose, came and went. Then a new step, a recalculation. The intruder stood at the threshold of Hale's landing and flicked a light touch at the door, a gloved fingertip finding the hairline gap. A small push. The latch did not give. The tape on the hook held. Downstairs, Yavuz coughed. A dry teacher's cough with a rebuke in it. The intruder froze. The contact mic recorded a long quiver through the wall as if a hand had steadied itself on paint. For half a second, nothing moved. In that half second, you can hear the city decide whether to permit what comes next. The plan shifted. Instead of going for the door, the intruder turned toward the living room window, a habit of burglars who prefer glass to wood. The rug edge at the corner lifted under a shoe and slid forward, and a knee hit the floor with a soft sound and then a sharper one as bone found wood under thin carpet. A shallow curse, not in anger but in adjustment, escaped a mouth that did not like to talk around a mask. The contact mic heard the friction as a smear in the waveform. No impact from a falling hook. On the radio, the scripted bruise would be wrong now. The city had taped over its moon. I took one step into the landing. The intruder heard me or sensed the new weight on the floor and moved backward into the stairwell. I did not chase. I am a producer with a recorder, not a patrol officer with a belt and training and authority to fall on a man. The intruder went down fast, the careful foot now a series of economic sounds. A body that had practiced exits in many buildings. Asuman did not try to block. She bent to cinch the grocery bag as if to ask the air to forgive her for being present. Yavuz rustled his newspaper a second time and cleared his throat in the universal dialect of "Do not embarrass me by making me dangerous." The building calmed. The slate rolled. The contact mic continued to record the wall's small tremors. In the station, the voice finished its recitation and handed the air back without apology. Amir did not speak for 3 beats. Then he began to talk about the history of the word threshold, a safe and oddly appropriate subject. The listeners who understood what had not been said would fill in the missing sentence with their own breath. Hale returned 2 minutes later, carrying a carton of eggs she had bought for the household to make the return plausible. She looked at the tape on the hook, then at the rug edge, then at me. Her face went through 3 expressions in quick order. "Thank you for being here. How dare this happen in my building? What happens now?" We called the police. They came with the soft shoes of men who have learned to make their arrival less alarming than their news. I allowed myself the blunt language of after. A suspected intruder had been interrupted. No contact made. A fall avoided. A carpet burn in place of a bruise. A wall that wore the print of a gloved hand in the form of smeared dust that could be brushed into a small paper envelope. The officers listened to the elevator belt smell as if it might confess. They did not roll their eyes when I showed the contact mic and the slate. They wrote down the time and accepted copies of the recordings with the sort of attention that good beat cops bring to odd nights. One officer looked at the hook and nodded without being told what it would have done. Some injuries are legible even when they do not occur. Outside, a car idled with its engine ticking over like a weak metronome. The engine note came from a model that had been popular among security companies a few years ago, the sort of sedan that wore its anonymity like a uniform. I stepped to the window and saw only the roofline and the edge of glass. The car pulled away with an unhurried courtesy that held a message. The message said, "We can wait a week." After the police left, we reset the corridor. I smoothed the rug edge. I rechecked the tape on the hook. I collected the recorder and filed the file names with the same care I give to a fragment of lullaby heard on a broken frequency. Hale made tea because action is a way to say I am not a victim. She set the iron key dish on the floor as I had asked and smiled at how wrong it looked there. The wrongness would save her, for now. At the station, we pulled the night's anomalous segment against last week's. The words had been the same until the moment of injury. The phrase about the crescent contusion was gone. In its place, the voice described a reddened scuff on the forearm, as if the storyteller had walked the scene after the fact and adjusted his language to match. The interval tone returned at the end with a tiny warble, a sign of a machine being asked to carry more load than it was meant to, or a sign of a hand that had been less sure. The hairline differences were where the body lives in a ghost. The future had flexed. It had not snapped. It had accepted interference and rewrote itself between the Thursdays. If we had not taped the hook, the broadcast would have been correct in every line. If we had tried to turn the corridor into a police checkpoint, perhaps the intruder would have stayed away and the voice would have become a rumor again. Instead, we had nudged the pattern and discovered the elasticity of a clock that pretended to be fate. Someone was feeding the loop with text. Someone was correcting it when the city moved. At midnight, I sat alone in the booth and listened to the interval tone on loop, the 3 notes falling, the tiny whistle on the edges, the faint tap 2 beats before the first sentence. The tap felt human. A ring against a wooden desk, a nail against a case, a habit someone had learned while cutting and splicing tape, a gesture in the air before speech. I thought of Salim in the production booth late at night, recording safety messages for extra cash, clicking 3 beads of his strand without realizing he had married his hands to a clock. I thought of Ayaz in his studio with a tone he did not want me to hear buried under his reducer. I thought of a car idling in patience near Hale's building during the brownout. The person who had come up the stairs had not been startled enough by the coughs to flee in confusion. He had left in order. An intruder who respects order listens to schedules, not prophecies. I wrote in my notebook, the broadcast updates only between weeks. It does not change midstream. The hand behind it believes in revision more than intervention. If given new truth, it will accept it and pretend it always knew. We would need to break that habit. We would need to teach the loop to accept something that could not be rewritten without exposing the writer. Before I left the station, I checked the clock on the wall against my watch and against the logger. All three agreed in the simple way good timepieces do. Outside, the sea answered the night with a dull shine. The city had not been saved. It had been delayed. Delay is space in which to work. I sent Hale a final message that said sleep. I told her to keep the tape on the hook until I cut it myself. She replied with a single word. Understood. In the dark, I could picture her hand on the lamp, her face in the glass, the key dish on the floor where no one would think to place it. The morning would come. The radio would hum in its racks. The hill would continue to carry our breath. The second Thursday had not killed a woman. It had shown us who was listening. Part 6, Numbers in the Lullaby. I took the tone off the night and made it walk under lights. In the production booth, I set the 14-minute segment on a timeline and split the 3 descending notes into their own room. I built a copy that would not clip the edges. Then I slowed it by a precise factor and listened for the parts that live between the parts. A good tone is like a staircase. You can stand on each step and feel the rise in your knees. The first interval fell by a clean ratio. The second fell by the same. The differences between the notes were not decorative. They were measurement. I printed the frequencies and wrote the deltas in the notebook. 7 to 1. 1 to a fraction that matched the minute we kept circling. I mapped the pattern across both captures. The shape held. The 3 notes were not a call sign. They were a calendar. 7 days, no hours, no seconds. Then a case-specific offset laid on top like a hand placed on a table to claim it. I pushed the tone further apart and trimmed a strip of silence just after the second note. In the noise bed, a series of humps lived under the hiss like pebbles under shallow water. They repeated. I cut them out and laid them end to end. The pebbles turned to bits. Not clean binary. Not a modern digital header. Something older and lazier, the way a station tag rides inside the radio data system band in a car radio when you are near the tower. The bits were not enough to tell a story. They were enough to name a room. I traced the pattern and built a small key out of guesswork and stubbornness. The letters that climbed out were not the letters of our station. They belonged to a ghost. TNY, then a gap, then 1040. I said the letters out loud in the empty booth, and the air did not repeat them back. I knew the shape. I had seen it in a photograph from a library box that smelled of mildew and old glue. I went hunting. The archives in the basement of the university kept their radio history in steel cabinets that had given their paint to decades of cardboard. I handed the clerk a slip and got a folder with a rubber band so tired it needed pity more than a replacement. Inside were circulars from the years when the city rehearsed crises as if practice could teach courage. A wartime station had carried drills and scripts, old voices reading instructions for days nobody wanted. The call letters were TNY. The frequency would have belonged to a medium wave rig that is now a foam of memory at the edge of sleep. They had once carried civil alerts and shelter instructions. The file had a photograph of a tone generator in a rack with a label that read bench tone. The caption named a technician who had kept the rigs alive long enough for the city to be tired of fear. I found the technician in a small apartment with a view of a half-finished building and a fig tree that insisted on doing its work anyway. He was the age where faces thin and eyes sharpen. His tea smelled of mint pounded in a mortar with a wooden pestle the size of a rolling pin. He set the cup in front of me and let me make the first sentence for him. I told him about our 3 notes. I told him about the minute. I told him about the way a voice had drifted in at the same time for 2 Thursdays and laid out a death like a schedule. He looked out the window toward a water tank striped with rust and nodded slowly, as if the city were taking attendance. We used to keep a loop, he said. We called it the Moivin loop. The assistant, When power dipped, the loop would fire and read a script that said to stay calm, to look for water, to use the radio as a friend. I set the loop to a quartz clock because the mains could not be trusted. He smiled without pride. The clock liked to be ahead. It was never late. We recorded our tests with the tone you heard. It was a habit, a note to ourselves. It meant a hand was on the bench and the chain was alive. He spoke about the old deck as if it had been a pet that refused to learn tricks and had therefore earned affection. The loop had been a cart machine, a tape carousel inside a hard body. Clicked from notch to notch as days passed. If power dipped, it would fire a module into the chain and a calm voice would take the air. Sometimes the loop would wake into a room with no one to hear it but the man who had wired it. He would listen to his own work and be briefly proud of how ordinary it sounded. When the fear lost its audience, the loop was decommissioned. He said the word as if it meant the end of a career. The bench tone generator went into storage. The deck went into a bin. The voice, recorded in 1,000 cuts by actors who took their coins and left, went into a metal can and was forgotten. The tower changed. The city grew. The men grew older. We buried the last reel tape under a foundation at the hill, he said. It felt proper to give it back to the dirt that had held the masts. We were sentimental. The rack logs said the loop had been removed. The paper was satisfied. Little machines have a way of remembering things whether you sign them out or not. He had the hands of someone who never throws away a good screw. He had a ring that clicked against his cup the way a small knock had clicked in our recordings. I watched the habit form and tried not to let my attention show. He saw anyway and smiled again. He tapped the cup once more on purpose to test me. Then he stopped, as if withholding the note could change my conclusion. Brownouts, I said. We have them at 2116. Your loop would sense that as a dip. It would pull the relay. If someone had wired a ritual machine into a modern silence sensor, or if someone had taught the modern sensor to honor an old shape, the path would accept a voice from outside the studio. The station would become a listener. The city would hear a test dressed as a story. He nodded. His voice softened. That is my sin, if you want to call it that. I taught the habit to the chain. I told it to wake on a dip. I laced the path so that an honest emergency could speak without permission. It was the right choice when panic was a tool that could be balanced by instruction. It is the wrong choice when the instruction is bent by someone else. Who else, I asked, who knew the habit and loved it? Anyone who watched me work. Anyone who learned from men like me. Anyone who played in radio rooms after hours because there is no drug like a fader under your palm. He looked at my notebook and at the coil of wire sticking out of my bag and decided to stop pretending he did not know me. The assistant is a personality more than a device. It does not like to be shut down once it is fed. You will need to make it full and lay it to sleep. I left him with the promise that the city owed him no apology and perhaps a thanks he would not accept. On the street, I felt the air change as if a front had passed. I called Amir and Salim and told them what I had learned. The path had an old emergency mouth sewn into its modern face. The habit had been a kindness then. Now it had become an invitation. Someone had wired a cart machine into the shrine on the hill to satisfy belief and to enjoy the texture of tape and buttons. But the voice that had spoken was not inside that plastic box. It had been carried there from elsewhere. It had used the loop as a lever. I went back to the station and took apart the tone again. The bits remained there like insects preserved in amber, letter shapes trapped in noise. I teased out more of the tag and found a partial date in a forgotten format, the way an old typewriter puts a private accent on a public word. The date did not match our week. It matched the date the Mauvan loop had first been tested on the hill. The tone carried its history like a scent. At the bakery door, Salim stood with flour on his forearms and a paper hat flattened into an apology. He listened to my summary and let the guilt cross his face without permission. He had the look of a man who keeps machines alive out of love and knows how easily love becomes interference. His prayer beads were on the counter near the register. The strand was missing 3 beads. I told him about the buried tape. His eyes lifted toward the hill as if he could see the foundation from Katakoi. He said he had dreamed of rooms that remembered their own instructions and woke up to make tea and lean his head against the cool tile. He did not say he had touched the loop. He did not have to. The fear in the sentence behind his eyes said enough. But the work was not his alone. The voice had used more than a technician's habit. It had used a thief's patience. That night, I drew a diagram on paper with dull pencil so my hands would slow. Studio, silence sensor, emergency insertion, link, hill, ritual deck, old relay, brownout dip, ghost carrier. I drew the 3 notes as steps and wrote the numbers beside them. 7, 0, case. I added a small rectangle near the foundation and wrote metal can. If there had been a burial, there might be a survivor. A tape, a loop, a voice that had once read the city how to keep water cold. At 2 in the morning, I went back into the booth and listened to the interval again, knowing it would now refuse to be only a sound. It had become a map. The descending notes were not a hymn. They were an address and a time. The soft pebbled bits carried an old call sign and a promise made to a frightened decade. The faint tap was a hand. The hand could belong to an engineer who loved the sound of his bench or to a younger one who mimicked the gesture for private theater. The tone had turned from a charm to a receipt. If the loop had learned to speak again because of brownouts, then the loop could be taught to speak something that would stop the theft. If the loop had woken because its clock had been set 1 week forward, then the clock could be stopped at the minute that mattered. But to do any of that without turning the city into a room where superstition wins, I needed the core artifact and the rule it obeyed. The tape that will not stay buried. The logic that clicks like a notch on a wheel. Near dawn the hill went gray and then olive. I called a friend on a crew that does honest night work with shovels and permits that look more official in the first light. I asked for a few quiet hands and a place to stand that would not embarrass anyone if we were wrong. He asked if we were digging treasure. I told him we were digging up a voice that had not learned it was retired. He laughed without much humor and said to meet him at the service road after midnight. I closed the notebook and wrote the last line for the day. The lullaby is not sentimental. It is a scheduler. The numbers are the promise. The old call sign is the signature. The assistant lives where we put it and wakes when we let the lights bend. Tomorrow we will go to the foundation and ask the dirt to return what it was given. Then we will see whose hands have spliced modern sentences into an old chorus. Part 7, the tape that will not stay buried. Midnight put a dull edge on the hill. The towers hummed as if they were holding the sky in place with a low note. My friend Sem met me at the service road with 2 men who knew how to lift earth without waking a city. Their permits were in their pockets and their sense of timing was better than any clock I carried. A fox crossed the path with the casual arrogance of a creature that does not care about transmitters. We walked the slope without talking. The wind moved steady from the water. I led them to the rectangle of soil I had traced with my finger days before. Sem knelt, pressed his palm to the ground, and nodded once. He drew a quiet square with a folding ruler, then shaved the skin of dirt away with a flat spade. The first inch was powder dry. Below that the soil turned darker and held together like a thought that does not want to be spoken. A few inches down the spade kissed metal. The sound was small and final. Sem glanced at me as if to ask whether I wanted the honor. I shook my head. He has a way of making a moment gentle even when it is not. He widened the hole with care and cleared the top of a box. It was an ammunition can, the kind with a lever clamp and a rubber gasket under the lid that tries to keep time and air out. The paint was military green turned brown by weather. The stenciled numbers had flaked into dots like a constellation that no one had named. We lifted the can onto a canvas sheet and wiped away grit. Sem levered the clamp with the same slow pressure he uses when turning a stubborn valve. The seal held its breath, then sighed. The lid rose. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, a 1/4-inch reel sat in a plastic case with a crack on one corner. A label had been taped to it and then taped over again. The topmost label said Muavin, Cycle 7 in block letters that had not learned cursive. The tape under it bore an older hand and an older date. The handwriting was familiar from the log on the shack wall. I put on cotton gloves without making a ceremony of it and lifted the reel. The plastic felt sound. The tape at the head was not brittle. Someone had checked it recently enough to matter. The hub smelled of the faint sugar of old acetate and a ghost of oil. On the edge of the leader, a thin seam ran across the width. Fresh splice. The adhesive looked glassy in the light. We packed the can and the reel and the paper into a bag and covered our hole. Sem tamped the earth with the flat of his spade until the skin looked like it had never been lifted. He set the same stone back in the same place and stepped on it once in the same direction a previous foot had gone. You do not leave a grave that advertises itself. I took the reel to the shack because the hill deserved to hear what it had carried. The maintenance room kept its own chill and its habit of hums. I fed the tape onto a deck that still had pride in its bearings. The capstan took the leader and pulled. Room tone stepped out as if it were a person leaving a train and finding the platform empty. After that, a woman began to read. Her voice had the classic weight of public service. Clear vowels, consonants that preferred to land softly. The language was from a decade when instructions were written by committees that believed in calm. Shelter in place. Keep bottled water. Do not use elevators in a fire. Move downhill from smoke. The voice was a companion more than a guard. Every few minutes the deck clicked and advanced a notch on a small index wheel. The sound had the old pleasure of machinery that keeps its promise. I watched the wheel count a set of perforations and touch a reed switch with a shy kiss, a contact that would trigger a relay if asked to. The cadence matched 7 days in a patient sequence. Count. Advance. Ready to speak again. Midway through the reel, the room tone shifted by an amount my ear recognizes when it has lived with a machine long enough. The splice rolled under the heads. The modern insertion wore a slightly different grain, like a new plank laid into an old floor. Then a voice. Not the woman from the drills. A male narrator, calm and patient, with a cadence that could pass for a yaz if you only listened to the rhythm and not the body behind it. The sentences climbed in the same way our on-air segments had climbed. The phrasing matched. It named no address, supplied no names. It was a template, a skeleton for a script. It was the future speaking without yet choosing a street. I stopped the deck and lifted the tape to the light. The splice line looked clean to a casual eye. To a hand that has seen too many hurried repairs, it looked impatient. The adhesive flashed a little under the light. I took out a swab and brushed the seam with a patience that has paid rent in my life. When I lifted the swab, I could see a dust the color of very tired snow clinging to the wet. Flour. Fine enough to live in the seams of a shirt. Fine enough to ride the air above a bakery and settle in the crease of tape where a fingertip holds a splice flat. I sealed the swab in a vial and labeled it with time and place. I wrote the words in my notebook too because I do not trust that labels will not peel at the wrong hour. Cyanoacrylate. Flour contamination. Shack at the hill. Muavin cycle 7. Fresh splice. I said the words under my breath so that my mouth would know the shape. A habit learned from nights when names slip away if not spoken. I let the deck run to the end. The female voice returned to give the room its manners back. The wheel clicked. The relay did not engage because I had not armed the insertion. The machine did not sulk. It accepted its place in the chain like a person who knows they are old but still valuable in a crisis. Back at the station, Amir waited in the booth with a look that mixed relief with the fatigue of stewardship. Salim stood at the doorway with his hands in his pockets, as if to keep them from touching anything that mattered. I set the reel on the desk and did not make eye contact with either man until I had plugged the deck into the monitor bus. Then I let the hill speak through the speakers. When the female voice read the generic instructions, Amir closed his eyes. He had been a boy when the city rehearsed fear like a chore. You could see him listening to his younger kitchen, to a mother who filled bottles and stacked blankets because a voice had asked nicely. When the splice rolled and the modern cadence cut in, he opened his eyes. He heard the likeness to a yaz, and I saw his mouth tense. He reached for a fader and then let his hand fall. He is the kind of man who has learned not to grab a thing simply because it is near. Salim moved closer. He breathed shallow. His wrists carried a dusting of flour that no soap seems to fully remove in a life that runs between ovens and racks. He leaned in to see the splice under the light as if light could call history to account in public. I told them what I had found on the seam. A fresh adhesive. a trace of bakery flour, a line where old tape met new sentences. Salim looked toward the stairs as if the smell from the ovens below might rise to judge him. He said he baked at night because the owner trusted him with dough more than with customers. He said he liked the quiet and the way a room sighs when it warms. He did not say he had spliced anything. He did not say he had not. He did not need to. The flour could have come from me. It could have come from 100 shirts that had touched the same stairwell. The world sheds trace the way a tree sheds leaves. Amir shook his head. I do not own that deck. I did not ask for it. I did not know a loop still slept under our hill. His voice was clean but hurt. The idea that his station could be made to speak without his consent offended something essential in him. I told him the truth I could stand on. The ritual device exists and is being used as a lever. The reel inserts do not live on that reel. The reel holds a habit, a relay, and a tone that teaches the chain to say yes. A hand is placing a new segment where an old one used to live, then using the brownout to make the path obedient. The flour is a strong suggestion. It is not a conviction. The glue is modern. The cadence imitates a style that already owns ears. We will not let either vanity or guilt be the author of our conclusion. We played the splice against the broadcast segments from the last 2 Thursdays. The waveform slotted into the same couch. The breaths lined up too neatly for coincidence. The tiny tap 2 beats before the first sentence lived here too. I could hear the ring again, metal against wood. I watched Salim glance at his hand, at the band he wore, and then put both hands flat on the desk as if to prevent them from making sounds without his permission. I took a small sample of adhesive right at the edge with a scalpel and placed it in another vial. Later, I would ask a friend in a lab to tell me what brand family it belonged to. Cyanoacrylate is a simple truth wearing many masks. Sometimes the mask is enough to name the shop. Sometimes the mask just leads you to a street. We sat in the silent room and let the deck turn. The 3 notes played in my mind, though the speakers were quiet. The hill had not cared that we had opened it. The hill would carry whatever we fed it until someone kinder pulled the plug or the city grew a new habit. I asked Amir for the old engineer's log, the one with the pencil music. We compared the hand on the Muavan label to the hand in the margin. The old lines matched the older label under the new tape. The new block letters floated on top like a second skin. Someone had pointed to history to bless an act. That someone had hoped we would see the old label and stop asking questions after we felt nostalgia. I asked Salim to walk me through his hours again. He was precise without performance. He baked after midnight. He came upstairs to the station to record safety messages and to format announcements. He sometimes used the production booth to clean audio for friends because he believed in debts as a form of mercy. He touched the chain only to keep it from starving. He said the word starving as if saying it would let us forgive the rest. I asked him where he kept his personal tools. He pointed to a drawer and opened it. Inside were a small screwdriver set, a splicing block for tape that looked like a toy to anyone born this century, a razor blade wrapped in paper, and a cheap plastic bottle of instant adhesive with a broken cap. The bottle belonged to glue bought at a corner hardware store. The brand was not an expensive one. A fringe of crystalline crust gathered at the mouth where the cap failed to seal. The crust held a dust as fine as smoke. He saw my gaze. He lifted his hands. He said he used the glue for paper labels and to mend a cracked headphone hanger, and he had borrowed the splicing block because he wanted to understand old methods that men he admired had loved. His voice stayed level. He did not argue. He did not confess. I took a sample from the glue crust with the same care I used on the reel seam. The lab would tell me if the chemistry matched the tape. It would not tell me about motive. Motive belongs to people, not to glue. I left the reel with Amir in a locked cabinet that had once guarded a set of microphones that did not survive the first digital upgrade. He signed a chain of custody that none of us believed would change the mind of a thief. We did it anyway because ritual does not only belong to thieves. On my way down the stairs, I paused at the bakery door. The air was sweet and heavy. The ovens glowed like calm eyes. The owner rolled sesame with his palms and slapped loops into rings with the rhythm of a prayer. Salim worked beside him with a towel thrown over his shoulder. He moved between heat and flour with the body economy of a man who knows how to be necessary. He glanced up at me once and gave a small nod that could have meant everything or nothing. Outside, the street kept its small talk. A cat tapped a cracked window with one paw and was rewarded with a crust. A scooter rattled past like loose coins in a can. I walked back to the station and sat in the booth alone and listened without speakers. I thought about hands that splice new sentences into old loops. I thought about men who love schedules because schedules make grief feel governable. I thought about a car that idled outside a building during a brownout and a ring that tapped would just before a voice read the future like a weather report. The hill had given us the artifact. The splice had given us a direction. The flower had given us a scent. The next step would require watching the hour when a man feels safest with his machines. I would need to sit with Salim during the long quiet run between ovens and microphones and see whether his fear was a shadow cast by someone standing behind him. If he was the hand, I would know it by the way the room read his pulse. If he was the glove, then the hand would come to use him and leave fingerprints on his tools. I wrote one line at the end of the page. Salim is either the hand or the glove. Either way, the hand will come back at the same minute. I intend to be there when it reaches for the switch. Part 8, The Engineer's Hour. The city at 2 in the morning is a narrow road that runs through sleep. The bakery below the station worked by the same clock it had when radios were still furniture. Heat rose through the floorboards like a second tide. Salim moved between ovens and sink, between bench and door, with the quiet focus of a man who treats tasks as islands to be ferried to one another without wasting water. I took a chair in the production booth with the door cracked so the smell of sesame and yeast could fold into the smell of warm electronics. The console lamps gave the room an old aquarium glow. The racks murmured like animals settled for the night. I placed my notebook on the desk and did not open it yet. Some hours resent the sound of paper. Salim came up at 2:30 with a tray of simit. He set it on the file cabinet and wiped his hands on a towel that had turned thin with use. He went to the small desk by the window where his laptop sat open. He tapped the trackpad and a block of text woke on the screen. It was the shape of a script without a voice yet. He had marked beats with timid headings as if not to disturb them. He did not look at me while he worked. I let the silence hold until it felt natural. "You record safety messages at this hour," I said. It was not a question. The town sleeps better if the reminders are recorded by someone who knows the difference between a fuse and a prayer. Your cadence tells people you mean it. He almost smiled. The station pays a little. The bakery pays a little. Between them, a week behaves. He rolled the chair closer to the desk. The laptop screen showed a window I recognized from the tools that turn speech into text when humans are busy. He fed it short stretches from police blotter calls where names had been scrubbed but details remained. The machine separated vowels and consonants as if sorting beans on a cloth. His cursor flicked to select dates and replace them. Thursday became next Thursday. 2117 sat in the same place it had in our captures. A macro, I said. Offsets instead of calendar entries. You are building templates that sound like forecasts because they are built from the dullest past. He did not deny it. He pinched the bridge of his nose and let his hands fall. His prayer beads lay on the desk, looped into a figure that suggested a habit interrupted. 3 beads were missing from the strand. He reached for them without thinking and then withdrew as if touching them would confess something he could not take back. I used to listen at night with my sister, he said. She had a way of hearing the city as if it were a person on the other side of a wall. When a voice asked for help on air, you could hear how serious it was by how the room sounded behind it. Once, 3 winters ago, a late call sent a patrol to a corner where a man with a knife had put his hand on his own throat to prove something to a woman who had stopped loving him. The patrol arrived in time. My sister told me the station had saved a life. She told me radio is a good superstition to keep. He let the story sit. Then he looked at his hands. She died 6 months later. Not like a story. On a bus. Wrong hour. Wrong driver. The city forgot to blink. No one was listening at the right minute. I started staying later. I repaired things. I kept the chain quiet. I told myself that if I could make the link sturdy, then the good calls would travel faster. When the brownout started, the bench tone woke. The old loop put its hand up like a student who does not know if he will be called on. The first time it happened, I thought the station would be blamed for the interruption, so I pushed a clean sentence into the gap. I told the city to breathe. He turned the laptop so I could see what he built. Blocks of text from calls and reports. Names cut. Addresses masked. A machine had cleaned the language into the voice of no one in particular. He had a button that stamped next week over the date. He had a habit of replacing a family name with a city name to soften the blow. He kept the paragraph endings short so the intervals felt deliberate. He had made a shape that the loop could accept when the brownout bent the door. I only meant it to be noise that calmed the chain, he said. The broadcast path is like an old animal. If you feed it the same thing at the same hour, it stops waking the people who own it. After the first Thursday, people called to say they had heard a strange announcement that did not belong to anything. They sounded scared. I told myself it was better to be clear next time, to say something about a place and a mistake to avoid. I stayed up and wrote. I took the old spit of a loop and taught it to carry a simple kindness. He swallowed. Then people heard me, or heard a voice that wore my measurements. I found myself standing in front of the cart, listening for the tone that told me the bench was alive. You touched the Moivin deck, I said. You tuned the quartz to be early. You gave the habit permission. He nodded. His voice stayed low. I did not plan a death. I read an almost accident as if it were a weather report and told myself that if a woman heard it, she would leave home 5 minutes early and thus leave her bruise in a cupboard. I never recorded names. I used the blotter to find the kind of trouble the city rains on people who have no umbrella. He held the beads again. At 21:17 I click 3 beads because the tone loves 3s. He laughed once without humor. Superstition takes a shape even in a person who distrusts superstition. You are not alone in the chain, I said. Someone listened to your rehearsal and built a crime around the timing. Someone took your forecast like a menu and adjusted a detail to skirt the places we patched. When the hook could not fall, the rug did. When a nurse coughed, a careful foot withdrew and then returned a minute later. A man sat in a car during the brownout with the patience of someone who prefers locks to knives. He used a narrowcast on the pirate band to replay your segment to a single ear. Salim stared at the screen as if letters could rearrange into a confession that would spare him. He scrolled to a line where the macro had replaced a day with next Thursday. The cursor blinked, unhelpful and patient. He tapped a key and the heading reformatted to a cleaner font. He had the nervous energy of a man who polishes a doorknob on a door he cannot open. Show me what you inject, I said. Not the on-air path. Your test. The little feed that you claim keeps the animal calm. He opened a folder labeled bench. Inside were short files with dates that never matched reality. He played one. The tone fell. A male voice read a paragraph about a boiler inspection that would take place overnight at a row of apartments. It advised listeners to open a window if they smelled gas and to call a number that did not ring to any known provider. The words were harmless and precise. But under the first word, as softly as a moth hitting glass, was a tap. Ring on wood. The same small knock I had marked in our captures. I looked at his left hand. He wore a ring that had been sized once and then not again in years. A narrow band of metal met the desk when his finger drifted. He saw my eyes and lifted his hand away as if the wood had burned him. Where do you arm the insertion? I asked. Which relay do you ask to bow? He hesitated, then stood and went to the rack. His body knew the order of the panels without his eyes. He pointed to a small patch that had been added to the silence sensor bay. A thin cable bridged the modern sensor to a relay block that had no business living in a digital room. The block was old style. A reed switch sat under a cover that had been printed in a color once called ivory and now called dirty. A wire led from the block to a socket on the wall plate that should have been capped. The socket led to the hill. A device at the hill listened for a drop in mains and then presented the bench with an open hand. You built a courtesy between 2 eras, I said. You thought you were teaching them manners. Someone else learned your manners and now walks in without knocking. He nodded. His eyes had gone dry in the way a man's eyes do when the night has pulled all the water out of him. He looked at the beads and did not touch them. Who knows your habit, I asked. Who watches you work? Who has the tools to stand outside and still be inside? A few names lived in the list in his head. A man who repairs antennas for half the stations no one can afford to shut down. A security consultant who likes side jobs that pay in cash and keys. A rival producer who treats the station as a building with a free room because no one can afford to kick him out. He said their names. I wrote them in the notebook with enough space between each that I could later add what I would prefer not to know. Salim closed the laptop. He looked at the simit he had brought up and then at me, as if a rung had been removed from a ladder and he had to decide whether to climb anyway. When the brownout comes, he said, the board braces. The racks breathe in. The tone falls. I tell myself I am smoothing a knot, but the knot wants to tighten. It is not just the loop. It is the men who live by schedules. They are the kind the city builds when it has more locks than patience. If I stop, will it stop? Or will someone else feed the habit and call it a favor? It will not stop by being ignored, I said. It will stop by being taught a different rule. You can make the loop carry a truth that cannot be adjusted afterward. You can pull it into the present and force a hand to reveal itself. But we cannot do it alone in this room. The moment we touch that relay, a man in a car will move. He will come to end your superstition and save his own. He nodded. He closed his eyes and breathed like a man who is about to step into cold water. When he opened them, he had the kind of fragile agreement I trust more than a vow. I will not touch the hill again without you, he said. I will keep the relay cold unless the building dips and panics. If you ask me to read a script that belongs to today, I will. If you ask me to sign my name to it, I will do that too. He swallowed. But if a life is saved, if a woman leaves her house 5 minutes early and misses a bruise, I will not apologize for the habit that got her door open. You will not have to, I said. We will ask the city to listen to a voice that admits it is human. We will invite the thief to be late for the first time. When he comes to silence the station, he will cross a camera and leave a trail he cannot rewrite between Thursdays. I collected the simit and left one on the console for Amir, who would arrive at dawn with the eyes of a man who both loves and resents a building that never sleeps. I took a last look at the relay block. The thin cable lay like a vein crossing from old to new. A fingerprint lived in the dust on its cover, a crescent where a thumb had rested. I took a photograph. The print did not belong to myth. It belonged to a hand that also held keys to other doors. Outside, the street was a long, cool breath. 2 ferries answered each other with horns, ordinary and sufficient. Somewhere in the city, a generator caught and held as the grid hiccuped. I felt the dip even without lights to announce it. My watch did not notice. I touched the face of it anyway. A small private superstition that I do not make grand. In my notebook, I wrote the last line before the sun lifted the roofs. Salim believes he is preventing deaths. The loop has learned his belief and speaks with it. The man who listens from the curb uses that belief as a map. Cut him off from the forecast. Make the forecast live. Force the hour to prove who owns it. Then walk him into a timeline that refuses to bend. Part 9, the copycat on the pirate band. I swept the band the old way first. Antenna on the roof. Notebook on my knee. I let the city talk and then I told it to repeat itself. Noise, music, the soft roar of air. Then a thin line rose where there should have been none. Not a station, not a taxi base. A sliver of carrier that woke at 21:16 and died at 21:30. It was as punctual as a debt. I mapped it for 3 nights. The line pulled from different roofs but always pointed the same way. Each time the carrier came alive, it carried the 3 descending notes at half volume under a layer of hiss. Then the same calm voice we knew. A replay, not live air. A recording made to serve one listener. When the voice ended, the line cut. No station identification. No habit of humans. On the 4th night, I brought a small direction finder that did not need me to brag about it. I turned with the needle and felt the pull settle on a single building whose windows stayed dark even when the street glittered. A service entrance at the rear had a keypad brushed by too many thumbs. Above it, a loop of wire hung from a nail like a bad idea. The loop fed a hand-sized transmitter in a weatherproof box. The coax left a fingerprint in the dust that led to a window air conditioner case that had not cooled anything in years. Inside, a hub of cheap light blinked where no humans lived. I did not force a door. I left the place intact and walked to the curb to think. The narrowcast did not call the city. Called a number. It did it with a voice-over internet application running on a small computer with a prepaid data modem. It had a list that contained one entry. At 2116 it dialed and fed the clip down the line. The phone at the other end answered without ringing. Auto answer. Secret settings. When the clip ended, the call ended. The tower's hum swallowed the rest. I brought the information to Amir in the booth. He kept his hands flat so he would not reach for a fader to solve a problem that did not belong to audio. Salim stood in the door. He did not look surprised that a thief preferred to be the only listener. He looked ashamed that the thief had been given a theater. We handed the location to a friend in a quiet unit that does honest work without press. He wore civilian clothes, which looked wrong on a man whose posture belonged to uniforms. He took a printout of timestamps and asked me for one sentence that would make a judge listen. I gave him this. A pirate transmitter is replaying our future segment to a single phone number at the same minute every Thursday. The hand that receives it adjusts one detail and moves early. He nodded. He had heard enough. By morning he had the box in a bag and a list of metadata the computer had been too lazy to hide. The address it dialed lived under the name of a shell company that once sold smart locks on discount. The number had been ported twice in 2 winters. The current owner of record was a security consultant with a picture on a company site where men pose with folded arms and talk about threat surfaces. His name was Serkan Tuzuin. Serkan held keys to many doors. Buildings, gates, breaker cabinets, server rooms that still smelled of ink even after printers disappeared. He liked certificates that sit in glass. He liked routines that bend without breaking. He liked to say the word audit. He kept his router logs because order feels like a prayer when the world will not kneel. We looked at his public work first. Contracts with property managers who pay late and then apologize with tickets to matches they do not attend. A side thread of consulting for a podcast network that paid in equipment and access instead of money. He had installed a microphone in a basement studio and left with a copy of the network's master password in his head. The basement belonged to Ayaz. Serkan downloaded Ayaz episodes within minutes of release. Nothing unusual there. Fans do that. But he also downloaded the raw files when the studio posted them to a private folder for producers. The access logs showed his device as first visitor more often than not. The pattern matched the narrowcast minutes. He took the voice he preferred and trained his ear on the cadence. His home router kept logs for a month. We got them because he had left the admin password as the name of the street he grew up on. A sentimental mistake that tidy men make when they believe no one will check their hallways. In the logs lived a small series of outbound calls at 2116 to an address that matched the transmitter's service. The packets resembled my own test clips sent to the Hill, except his carried only what the loop had already spoken. He mirrored Salim's habit without possessing Salim's conscience. At Hale's building, a dash camera had captured a sedan idling at the curb during the brownout. The long exposure made the headlights smear like the eyes of a tired saint. The car did not move. The man inside checked his watch without looking bored. When the cough sounded in the stairwell, the brake lights faded for half a second as if a foot had lifted. Then the car returned to its patient heartbeat. When the voice ended on the radio, the car rolled away. The license plate had a clean number that returned to Serkan's company pool. We watched him for 3 days. He carried himself with the ease of a man who is paid to be invisible until needed. He used elevators with a key switch when others waited for doors like citizens. He visited a breaker room in a building we did not yet know we cared about and touched the panel with the affection of a pianist warming up. His hands were quiet. He smiled rarely and only when a plan had the courtesy to obey him. We pulled his old crew for gossip and got the kind of answers men give when they fear a past favor might be reinvoiced. He liked schedules. He liked to test locks twice. He did not like knives. He preferred power and timing. He carried a battery lamp that fit in a pocket and a device that could interrupt a motion sensor by flooding it with a flat light. He knew how long a brownout lasts in different neighborhoods. He knew that some buildings take longer to wake. He knew that if a woman is warned, she will change one thing, not three. He knew that if you arrive early, you can move something small and let gravity do the rest. He was using Salim's weekly forecast as a menu. He took the 12-minute script and marked one line. He did not imitate the original act. He changed its contour. He would arrive an hour early to stage a lock so that a door leaned open more easily at 21:17. He would pull a bulb half loose so that a corridor agreed with him when the brownout bent its head. He would step back when a cough arrived, count 2, then move to the window where the rug had not been taped. He would leave before the neighbor knew whether to dial. He would be in the car when the voice finished. He would be far away when police arrived and told a woman she had been lucky. We needed to make luck into a plan that did not ask a woman to be lucky. I set the board on the table in the booth and laid markers where Sirkin had stood. I put a ring on the desk and tapped twice. The small sound lifted the hair on my arms. I wrote on the white card at the edge of the board. He adjusts one detail to dodge interference. He arrives early to prepare locks and power. He leaves during the brownout. He never misses the tone. Amir listened and said little. His face had the stillness of a man who has decided that anger is a luxury he will pay for later. Salim kept his hands in his pockets and looked at the relay block as if he could will it to tell a different story about him. The city breathed beyond the glass. I asked to see Sirkin up close. We did not approach him. We let him approach us. We scheduled a maintenance call at the station for a fictional fault in the rack ground. He arrived on time with a bag and a calm that tried to make me believe in competence as a virtue independent of motive. He looked at the boards with the affection of a collector. He asked where our breaker was and I told him, which was a lie. He looked at the silence sensor and smiled the way a man smiles at a child who has learned half a word. He did not touch the relay block. He admired its cheap plastic cover. I watched the way he moved his thumbs. No nervous flick. No ring knock. He did not belong to microphones. He belonged to doors. He ran a fingertip along the power strip and read the brand. He glanced at the clock once and not again. People who love timing more than mercy look at clocks only to confirm a habit they already trust. The quiet unit gathered with a warrant that afternoon and turned his routers into witnesses. The pirate box on the empty floor was already in a bag. The number it dialed lived in his second phone under a work profile that did not ring without permission. They recorded his face when he realized he had been expected. The expression was not shock. It was irritation at being early to a door that did not open. We did not rely only on that. The case would not stand if we made it a trick. We overlaid the dashcam of his idling car with the brownout curve from the utility. The match was selfishly precise. We placed his card tag on a gate in a building near Hale Street at 21:15. We found his inspection note inside the breaker panel at the same address, a folded paper with lines too straight for a man in a hurry. He had drawn 3 descending rectangles in the margin where others would doodle flowers or names. Habit reveals the hand. At the studio, I set the evening's plan. We would take the loop away from him. We would keep the brownout as a metronome but change the song. Salim would feed the chain at 21:16 with a segment that claimed to be from next week but would be live. We would put a voice on air that a thief could not edit after. A victim would speak in the present. A name would be said. Path would shift. Salim swallowed and nodded. He sat in the production booth and aligned the bench with his new resolve. Amir read the statement he would deliver after. He kept it short like a needle. He would say, "We do not publish prophecies. We publish recordings." He would say we had been taught a trick and now we were teaching it back. I called Hale. I asked her to do something most people should never be asked to do. I asked her to speak a truth a week early. I told her it would not bless a future. It would cancel a script. She listened without breathing into the phone. Then she said yes. She said she did not want to be a character in a man's calendar. She would read a sentence into the loop and make the loop honest. Before we went live, I walked outside and looked up at the city. Kamlika held its steady light. Fairies spoke to one another. A breeze drew a line across my face. Somewhere Sirkin checked his watch and smiled at the thought that time belonged to him. I wrote one line and put the pen down before I second-guessed it. Cut him off from the forecast, or make it turn on him. We will do both. I went back in. The hour tightened. The brownout leaned toward us. The board glowed. We took our places in a room that would not look different in a photograph when this was done. The difference would be in the breath. Part 10, writing tomorrow in the present tense. We rehearsed the lie that would be true. In the production booth, the clock apologized to no one. I marked time on paper to keep my hands still. Salim set the bench feed to arm at 21:16. He wired the relay so the chain would accept a segment labeled as next Thursday while every breath inside it belonged to now. Amir sat at the console with a single sheet folded in half. He had written 3 sentences. He planned to read only 2. Hale arrived with a scarf and the look of a person who refuses to be drafted but has chosen to enlist. We placed her in the booth with a microphone that had once read a lullaby to a city during a week of flooding. She touched the metal ring around the shock mount and steadied it as if the machine might need comfort. "You will hear the tone," I said. "After the second note, begin. The script on the paper says next Thursday. You will say tonight. You will say the name and the minute and the way he waits. Say it like a receipt." She nodded. Her voice, when she warmed up, carried the grain of stone worn by water. She read the sentence 3 ways. None of them were theatrical. The air in the room relaxed with each repetition, as if breath had found its place in the schedule. I set 2 cameras. One watched the entrance door at street level. The other watched the hall outside the booth where the relay lamp would blink. I linked both to a stream that would live in 3 places at once. The quiet unit had been warned. A patrol car drifted through the next street as if lost. A pair of plainclothes officers stood with coffee cups a block away facing a shop window that sold radios older than any of us. 2114 arrived wearing the smell of dust that warm gear exhale when nerves run high. Amir took the air with 2 callers who argued pleasantly about ferry routes. He let their voices round out the room. He did not overfill the minute. Salim rolled his chair back from the rack and flicked his eyes between his laptop clock and the wall clock and then settled on the sweep second of the slate, the only face that never blinks. 2116 leaned into us. The brownout pressed down like a large palm and let go. The hum in the rack stretched. The interval tone fell. 3 steps. The second note passed. Salim pointed. Hale began. Her first sentence rode the tail of the tone with the patience of a train gliding into a platform. She said the time as the clock showed it. She said her own name. She said the name of the man who had waited in his car and the way he counted to 2 when a cough interrupted him. She described his keys and his habit of testing a breaker panel with a fingertip as if it were a piano. She named the street near the second building on his list. She said that if he were to be at both places tonight, the only way would be if time bent for him. Tonight it would not. The bench took her words without protest. The relay lamp blinked once as if surprised, then held steady. The chain accepted the present the way it had accepted the counterfeit future. The studio meters moved. The ghost carrier nudged the link. The old loop, taught a new rule in a single breath, did not object. It was always a servant. I watched the street camera. A sedan turned the corner and stopped in a space a man might have believed preordained. The driver sat upright with the posture of someone who respects his own spine. He checked his watch even though the horizon would have told him as much. He touched the wheel at 10:02, then released and opened his hand as if weighing an invisible coin. The second camera caught the stairwell. The door opened. Sirkin stepped into the frame with a calm that could have sold locks to saints. He did not run. He moved with the speed of a man who never raises his heart rate unless a doctor orders it. He carried a small lamp in one pocket and a cutter in the other. He approached the rack room, saw the lens, and shifted to look like a hired man arriving at the wrong door. The stream went out. 3 mirrors of the same truth flashed in tiny delays. The quiet unit marked the minute. The patrol car rolled closer without turning on its lights. Down the hall, the relay lamp held like a constellation that finally remembered its own name. Hale kept reading. She did not accuse. She recounted. She named the earlier door he had prepared. the bulb he had seated too loosely 3 hours before. She said the word tonight again, and there was nothing mystical in it, only wait. Amir let her breathe and then faded the mica hair to keep the chain from clipping. He did not speak. He understood that the board had become a witness, and a witness should not narrate. Sirkin came through the second door into the on-air corridor and paused. His face crossed four expressions quickly: irritation at timing, calculation, a bad idea, a smile for a person he considered unequal. He saw the second camera. He stepped back and moved toward the rack with a motion meant to look like maintenance. His hand went to the relay plate, then stopped when the patrol officer in the doorway said his name as if greeting a coworker. Sirkin lifted both palms to show politeness that could be called compliance if it bought him a minute. He spoke in the tone of a contractor who has been wrongly billed. He asked who had called him and what fault he was here to clear. The officer looked past him at the lamp that had not yet blinked off and then at the clock that showed 21:17. He asked Sirkin to stand aside. Sirkin smiled and obeyed. Across the city, a second team entered the building that would have carried the next almost crime. They found a breaker panel taped with a neat folded note. They found a rug corner lifted a centimeter under a sofa leg. They found the narrow wedge that would have propped a door to swing on a whisper. The wedge wore a thumbprint in a curve that matched the relay plate at the station. The prints would have enough in common to make a prosecutor speak without checking his teeth in a spoon. In the booth, I kept the stream tight on Sirkin's face. He saw the lens and arranged his expression into something that could pass for patience or injury. Men who live by schedules always practice a mask in case a clock betrays them. He did not ask me to stop. He positioned himself to the side as if to be filmed was an indignity beneath him, not a problem for him. Hale finished the sentence that carried his name and then the sentence that carried her freedom. She ended with a clear period and let the room hold the sound of her breathing, as if to say that life was, in this minute, nothing more complicated than breath. She took off the headphones with both hands. Her fingers shook once and then were still. The interval tone should have returned. Stuttered. The first note fell a fraction flat, then corrected. The second refused to land. The third arrived late, indignant, and then softened. A machine somewhere on the hill accepted the new weight of immediacy and adjusted its pride. The bench had been taught to carry live truth. It had never been asked to do that. It preferred the courtesy of rehearsal. It bent and did not break. The officer in the hall asked Sirkin to accompany him. Sirkin nodded as if to humor a child. He stepped forward and then turned his shoulder as if to glance back into the rack room. He did not reach for the relay. He knew that act would place him in a sentence he could not edit. He walked out of the frame. The first camera caught him on the stairs with the same calm he had carried everywhere. Calm is not evidence. It is a signature. Amir took the fader and brought his mic up. His voice was the cleanest I had ever heard from him. "We do not publish prophecies," he said. "We publish recordings. Tonight you heard a recording laid into the chain at the minute you expected a script from the future. You heard a woman say her own name and another. We are a station. We are not an oracle. We will not be used as one." He let that sit. He did not add philosophy. He played 2 seconds of Street Air and then returned to ordinary programming. The board looked no different afterward. The meters returned to their nap. The clock advanced. Outside, the patrol car that had never turned on its lights started moving again with a dignified slowness. Down the block, the plainclothes officers finished their coffee. On the roof, the video process wrote itself to 3 drives like a schoolboy writing lines he will later be proud of. At the second building, the officers walked the floor as if an invisible teacher were grading their ghost work. They touched nothing without gloves. They photographed the wedge. They made a small bag for a small timeline. They turned off the light Sirkin had loosened and seated it properly, and the corridor looked too bright, like a room that had been forgiven. Back in the booth, Hale sat with her hands open on her knees. She listened to Amir speak the sentence that made the loop honest. She let out a breath that turned her shoulders into a line. She stood and hugged me with the careful pressure of a person who does not trust relief lasting longer than a song. Salim leaned against the door frame with his head tipped back. His eyes were wet but did not spill. He pressed his thumb to the relay plate without touching it. Hands remember. He looked at the prayer beads and finally took them up, then set them down again as if to break a habit by declaring it finished, not by denying it. The quiet unit texted a sentence that contained no exclamation. In custody. Secondary site cold. Evidence preserved. I watched the hill out the window. The towers kept their version of lighthouses. They did not celebrate. They continued. A fox would cross the service road later and sniff the place where we had opened the ground and replaced the skin. The bench tone would sleep until the next dip. The relay would wait to be told what to bow to. I made copies of the stream and carried 3 on my person and left 2 in the hands of people who would not lose them. Amir locked the rest in the cabinet that had become a superstition of its own. He sat down and let his body admit fatigue. The phone rang. Ayaz. He congratulated us on a trick that would make for good radio lore. He asked if we would be angry if he borrowed the structure. I told him there would be no structure if we had not named a man at the right minute. He said listeners loved fate that loses to courage. I said listeners deserve the truth about how courage works. He laughed in a way that asked me to be friends. I hung up. Later, when the paperwork had begun its slow page turning, I found the replay we had captured of the narrowcast. It had tried to dial at 2116 and had found a dead path. Its timing log showed a red entry where it expected green. I copied that too. A small confession in the language of machines. The city did not cheer. It breathed. A fairy sang its line. A dog barked twice. The baker knocked flour from a board. The meter held steady. The brownout did not return. The door at the bottom of the stairs closed with the sound that says until next time. I wrote 1 sentence before sleep pulled a shade over the room. The forecast failed. The crime did not occur. The loop carried a confession instead of a menu. Tomorrow we find who first taught the clock to wake at this minute, and we put the habit down in a way that keeps the city from reaching for it again. Part 11, the last 7 minutes. The retired technician met us at the station in the afternoon when shadows from the bakery sign cut a soft band across the floor. He brought a small canvas bag and a face that had decided to stop asking for forgiveness. Amir poured tea and did not add sugar. Salim sat with his hands folded on his knees like a student who expects the stern teacher and hopes for the kind one. I played the interval tone for the technician and watched his eyes while the 3 notes fell. He did not look surprised. He looked as if a whistle from a workbench had walked across years and tapped him on the shoulder. That is my tone, he said. Bench tone. I used it to check the emergency chain before any rehearsal. I wired the loop to wake during dips in the mains because the old building had a way of fainting. He set the bag on the table. I taught the path to accept a voice without asking the studio to bless it. It was mercy then. People needed the instruction before the fear. He breathed once. I left the habit behind like an open door. I did not mean to. We took him up to the rack. He touched the modern panels the way a retired carpenter touches a new ladder and approves its legs before climbing. He pointed at the relay block Salim had bridged to the silence sensor. He did not scold. He nodded once. You tried to be polite to the old ways, he said. You fed the habit at the minute it asked. The city does not like to throw away tools that still work. In the hill shack, he showed us the contact where his reed switch had lived. He tapped the cabinet with 2 fingers and then stopped. He understood that every knock counts now. He took a pencil from his shirt pocket and drew 3 descending notes in the margin of the old log where he had drawn them before. The pencil left a softer gray. He was an older man. Time darkens and time lightens. He had learned both. We told him how the loop had been taught tricks in his absence. How the cart machine had been dressed in old names and fed with new sentences. How a thief had learned to stand on the minute he had carved and had used it like a steps tool. The technician did not defend his invention. He asked a single question. Does the city still listen when the radio asks it to be calm? Yes, I said, but it listens best now when the voice admits it is human. It listened last night when Hale spoke. He nodded. Then he took a small quartz clock from his bag, the kind of clock you fit into a panel when you want a device to pretend it knows the calendar, and handed it to me. Set it to 2117 and stop it, he said. Give it to the loop like a last meal. then take away its fork. We did it that evening in the production booth with a care that felt like service. I set the little clock to the minute the hill had claimed for itself. The second hand ticked against the plastic like a bird behind glass. Salim reached out. He placed his thumb on the stem and pulled gently. The hand paused and then stilled. He let out a breath he had been holding for months. We spliced a final reel. The technician recorded a short apology in a voice that held no drama. He said he had given the city a habit in a decade that needed it. He said the habit had learned to misbehave. He asked the chain to sleep. Amir added a sentence about what a station is and is not. He said we carry what people say now. He said a simple sentence is stronger than any prediction. Hale read a line of thanks, not to us, but to the listeners who coughed in stairwells and watered basil and kept their doors honest. Her voice made the booth sound like a room with windows. We took the reel and the little clock to the hill just before dusk. Sem walked with us and did not speak. The towers hummed like animals at rest. At the foundation where we had lifted earth days before, the soil still remembered our shoes. We laid the reel in a new tin with a rubber gasket that would keep honest weather out. We put the quartz clock on top, still set to 21:17. His face looked calm. The technician pressed the lid closed with both hands and then looked up at the masts as if asking permission. The wind answered for them. We folded the ground back over and tamped it smooth. Sem set the same small stone in the same place and stepped on it once. He smiled. A grave knows when it has been made properly. Back at the station, Amir wrote the house rule on a card and taped it above the relay. No insert without human presence and a name. No loop armed by habit. No courtesy to ghosts. Salim wiped the dust from the relay cover and left it clean. He put the prayer beads in a drawer and closed it. He asked for probation without prompting and received it. He would repair. He would not predict. Ayaz sent a draft of a public mea culpa. He wrote about style and responsibility. He wrote about how a fashionable cadence can turn into a stencil someone dangerous uses to cut a mask. For once his sentences did not audition for applause. He asked to read the apology on our air. Amir said yes. Amir also told him he would cut his mic if a single adjective pushed its way into the apology to steal attention from the point. Ayaz laughed softly and said he had earned that threat. The charge sheet for Sirkin grew in orderly lines. Attempted homicide, unlawful interception, unauthorized transmission, possession of devices designed to interfere with alarms. His lawyer tried a theory about public service announcements and confusion. The timestamp stream from our cameras and from the second sight made the theory blush. The dashcam breaths and the utility brownout curve married each other neatly. The prosecutor did not grandstand. He recited. For 7 minutes, the city told the story of those years back to us. Those minutes began with the tone in my head and ended with a straight line on the logger where a strip of anomaly used to live. The technician sat in the booth with his hat in his hands. He did not take a bow. He watched the meters the way a person watches a new stove for a week to see if it keeps the room warm without burning the house. At 21:16 that night, the brownout did what brownouts do. The lights leaned and corrected. The relay lamp did not blink. The chain held its breath and then released it. No tone fell. Amir let the silence sit for a beat that felt like a held note and then spoke as if he were telling a child a simple fact. Good evening. You are listening to a station. We will talk to you as long as the power allows. If the power goes, we will talk again when it returns. If you need help before that, call a person and say your name. He opened the phone lines and took 3 calls from men who had never dialed a radio station in their lives. One was a baker on his break. One was a ferry engineer who said the engine had never loved him more than it did tonight. One was a guard who said the hill sounded like it was sleeping. We did not ask their names. We listened. Later, when the building quieted and the smell of bread sank into the floorboards, I sat in the booth and wrote the final notes that belonged to our investigation. I wrote that causality prefers tape edited with a steady hand. I wrote that a city owes itself present tense more than prophecy. I wrote that the assistant had been buried with its clock stopped. I wrote that the habit lived in men, not wires, and that men could be taught to rest. On the walk home, the sea pushed against the stones in Kadikoi. Fairies answered once and then again. The hill kept its patient light without ceremony. A dog barked twice in the lane behind the bakery and then fell asleep where the flower dust warms the air. I carried the last 7 minutes with me like a receipt folded into a pocket. It did not need to be read again to be believed. Final part, when the interval falls silent. Morning leaned through the studio windows and the city sounded like itself again. The bakery clattered pans. The tram rang for pedestrians who would not hurry. The racks in the control room gave off a low calm that felt like the breath of a sleeping animal. I sat at the console and rolled the logger to 2117 even though the minute was hours away. The timeline drew a straight bar and waited. Waiting is honest when it is not an excuse. Amir came in with his coat over one arm and a paper cup of tea that had traveled without spilling. He rested a hand on the board and looked through the glass into the quiet booth. He had the look of a man who has won an argument with a house that was not built to admit fault. He said we would open with a story about fairies that played music on fog days so captains could navigate by ear. He said we would run a call-in line for small victories. He said we would read letters. Salim arrived with flour on his sleeves and no beads in his pocket. He went straight to the rack and checked the relay plate even though he had checked it twice already. The lamp did nothing interesting. He smiled at that. He set a modest sign on the cabinet and taped it down. No unsupervised inserts. Human voice only. He touched the tape with his thumb and stepped back. I called Hale. Her building sounded different now. Not safer exactly. Just less drafted by the wind of habit. She told me she would move the iron dish back to the table when the week turned. She said the tape would stay over the hook until I cut it myself. She laughed when she said it. The laugh lived in a clean room in her chest that had not been open for days. At noon, I walked up to the roof and looked toward Kamlika. The towers did not notice me. They held the sky with the same care they had given yesterday. Somewhere under the hill, a tin box with a rubber gasket kept out the weather. Inside, a reel slept with a quartz clock on its chest. The clock's hands would not move. They would never again tug at a chain. The men who had loved that loop had laid it down without bitterness. The city had accepted the gift as one accepts the last letter from a friend who has decided to stop writing and live. Night came the simple way. Lights in windows. A smudge of cooking smoke that drifted and thinned. The board was ready. Amir took the chair and let the studio breathe. He avoided cleverness. He read a weather note, a ferry schedule, a short piece about the market where the fishmonger names every fish. He let a violin record play for a minute and then faded it before it could become nostalgia. 2116 arrived. The bulbs did not lean. The hum did not stretch. In the rack room, the logger drew its bar in complete sentences. No interval stepped down from some unlabeled place. 2117 landed and passed. The line held clean. The world noted nothing and moved on. Amir did not mark the minute. He told a story about a fairy horn that once started a song in a wedding band on the pier and how the drummer kept time with the water. He opened the phones and a guard called from the hill to say the masts sounded like they were resting and he did not mind the quiet. Another caller asked whether sound ever leaves a place. Amir said yes. It leaves and returns as memory. He said the station would carry what people needed to say when they could not be heard across the street. He said nothing about prophecy. I took the headphones and closed my eyes. The room gave me sea and cheap coffee and warm power. Beyond the glass, the bakery oven door slammed in a rhythm that used to mean dawn but tonight meant nothing but bread. A gull scraped a sound off the edge of the roof and let it fall. Somewhere a dog barked twice and then chose a different business. I filed the last notes of the case. Causality prefers tape edited with a steady hand. A city prefers voices that admit they are alive. The bench tone had been retired. The relay had been taught to keep its hands in its pockets unless a named person asked for help. The habit would travel for a while through the people who had listened every Thursday. They would turn down the volume at 2117 and listen for a ghost that did not arrive. After a few weeks, they would forget they had braced. That forgetting would be a kind mercy. I stepped outside with Amir after the shift. We stood on the stairs and listened to the ordinary night. The bakery cooled. The station warmed. We looked down the street and saw nothing arranged by a clock. The city spoke in present tense and left enough space between its sentences for breath. Somnolent Conspiracies signs off. If a city must hear the future, let it be because its people spoke loudly enough today. The story has ended. Thank you for listening to Dead Air After the Future Speaks, an investigation told not through headlines, but through the faint hum behind them, where the city learns to listen to itself. If you stayed through the static, through the hours between 21:16 and 17, then you already understand. What we call the future is just a recording that someone decided to stop. From the hill where the Mauvan loop slept, to the bakery floor where flour met signal, this story was about the people who refused to let prophecy become programming, about how a single voice, spoken in real time, can still rewrite a city's silence. Thank you for lending us your breath. If you felt the pulse of the signal, or if the silence after it stayed with you, subscribe, ring the bell, and share Somnolent Conspiracies with someone who still keeps their radio on at night. Your listening keeps these cases alive, long after the transmitters rest. Until the next frequency, keep your volume low enough to hear your own heartbeat, and stay awake between the signals.